When we talk about prisons in South Africa, we aren't just talking about cells and bars. We're talking about centuries of power, exploitation, and social control that left a legacy still visible today. The story begins long before the numbers, before modern law enforcement systems, even before the idea of prison as we understand it. It starts with colonial conquest, labor extraction, racial lawmaking, and the transformation of punishment into a tool of the state. In the mid-17th century, when European settlers established themselves at the Cape, the concept of incarceration as a primary punishment was still uncommon. Instead, punishment meant corporal methods, banishment, forced labor, or deportation. According to historical studies of early South African penal systems, imprisonment in the modern sense was introduced only gradually. Local tribal systems, pre-colonial justice, and indigenous forms of discipline persisted, but they were overwhelmed as the colonial state asserted its will. As the British and Dutch colonial administrations expanded, they began to impose new systems of control. When the Dutch arrived in 1652 at the Cape, there was little investment in building prisons. Punishment emphasized removal from society. But by the time of British occupation and the abolition of slavery in 1807, labor shortages demanded new mechanisms: arrest, incarceration, forced labor, and prison-style confinement. For those deemed to transgress emerging laws, these early institutions would establish patterns that would later become heavily racialized and institutionalized. Concentrations of non-white prisoners, harsh labor regimes, and linking incarceration with colonial economic exploitation. With the discovery of diamonds in Kimberley and gold on the Witwatersrand in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the economy shifted. Mines demanded cheap labor, and the colonial state, and later the Union and apartheid state, responded by criminalizing the movement and existence of black people through pass laws and similar legislation. The result: mass arrests, forced confinement, and prison labor systems that resembled the mining compounds themselves. As one historic analysis notes, the characteristic feature of the development of South African prisons was its resemblance to the mine compound. In effect, you can trace the modern prison system in South Africa back to the twin imperatives of racial control and economic extraction. In 1910, the four colonies merged to form the Union of South Africa, and the prison system began to be formalized. The Prisons and Reformatories Act of 1911 consolidated earlier laws, but it did little to humanitarianize the system. Racial segregation was already baked in. The segregation of prisoners, the criminalization of black life via pass laws, vagrancy laws, etc., and the use of convict labor for public works became standard. Prisoners were used to build roads, railways, and remain in harsh conditions. Over the decades, the prison system grew not purely because of crime, but as part of the racialized state's toolkit. Come 1948 and the election of the National Party. The era of apartheid begins. Penal policy becomes even more central to the system of racial domination. Arrests for political offenses increase, laws are broadened, and the number of people behind bars grows steadily. Many prisons once used primarily for common law offenders now hold political detainees, people convicted not simply for theft or violence, but for resisting the state. As one overview puts it, from the 1960s, ever larger numbers of political prisoners were added to the South African prison population. Among the most famous prison sites is Robben Island Isolated, off the coast near Cape Town. During the apartheid years, it became a symbol of resistance and suffering. Nelson Mandela spent 18 of his 27 years of incarceration there. Yet the architecture of the prison system also tells a story. For instance, Pretoria Central Prison, now known as Kagosi Mampuru II, dates from the 19th and early 20th century. and was later used to hold political prisoners under apartheid. It stands as physical testimony to how the state normalized control through incarceration. In the mid-20th century, new legislation tightened the system still further. The Prisons Act of 1959 formalized racial segregation within prisons, among other things. As the decades progressed, the inmate population swelled. Overcrowding became endemic. The conditions remained grim: communal cells, triple bunking, poor ventilation, minimal facilities. A Human Rights Watch report from the early 1990s described the prison system as established in the 19th century, institutionalized according to the logic of racial discrimination. Many prisoners were held for past offenses and labor law violations. By the time the apartheid regime was nearing its end, South Africa's prison system had morphed from a colonial instrument into a huge complex reflecting inequality, control, and marginalization. When the apartheid system ended and democracy came in 1994, one might have expected a radical transformation of the prison system. And indeed, some laws were repealed, such as racial segregation of prisoners. But transformation was only partial, and deep structural problems remained. Economic inequality, high unemployment, social dislocation, legacies of racialized law enforcement, and a justice system backlog meant that incarceration remained high. The causes multiplied: poverty, crime, gangs, drugs, awaiting trial detainees, children in adult facilities, and a system that struggled under the weight of its history. Overcrowding, under-resourced facilities, and long delays became characteristic. Today, South Africa often ranks among the countries in Africa with the highest numbers of prisoners. While many factors contribute: crime rates, socioeconomic factors, policing, awaiting trial populations, the history we have traced is integral. The architecture of control, built over centuries, helped create a system where prison is less about rehabilitation and more about management of marginalized populations. The fact that so many people are incarcerated is not simply a measure of crime. It is a legacy of how law and order, labor and race, punishment and politics have intersected. To fully understand the present, we must revisit the architecture of the past. Consider how past offenses in the early 20th century criminalized everyday black mobility and supplied labor to mines and public works. Those laws might seem minor today, but they were foundational. The prison system became a pipeline of control. The early scholars drew the link many decades ago. The continued incarceration of Africans for failing to pay taxes and for past offenses meant that men were still available for work in the road camps. In other words, incarceration, labor, and race were deeply intertwined from early on. Another factor was the mine compound system. Most people think of prisons as isolated buildings with cells, but in South Africa, the prison institution looked very much like the mine compound: large communal accommodation, strict oversight, forced labor, and minimal privacy. Many early 20th century prisons borrowed this model. This similarity gives us insight into how penal labor and incarceration were part of the same matrix. A prisoner made to work on public roads, in factories or fields, was not very different from a mine compound worker in terms of control and exploitation. The apartheid state's use of political imprisonment also left deep scars. Many activists, future leaders, and ordinary citizens were held for acts of opposition. The prison walls held not only criminals, as we normally imagine, but freedom fighters, dissenters, students, youth. Their incarceration shaped the narrative of resistance in South Africa. Inside prison walls, education programs were developed. Prisoners taught each other. Strategies of struggle were shared. Robben Island is often described as a university of the struggle. Thus, prisons functioned not only as spaces of punishment, but paradoxically, as places of political education and identity formation. But let's return to the numbers and how the system evolved after democracy. With the dawn of freedom in 1994 came big hopes for justice, rehabilitation, and humane facilities. Some reforms were introduced. The name change from prisons to correctional services. Attempts to reduce waiting trial delays, focus on rehabilitation. Yet these reforms quickly collided with structural realities. The legacy of inequalities meant that Black South Africans were still disproportionately represented in the justice system. Poverty and unemployment remained high. Gang violence, drug trafficking, and social exclusion persisted. The prison population continued to grow. Overcrowding became a chronic crisis. Today, the prison system is burdened. Many facilities operate at well over capacity. For example, one of the oldest institutions, Pollsmoor Prison in Cape Town, designed for around 4,300 inmates, now holds over 7,000. Wait trial detainees constitute a significant proportion of the population. The backlog in courts means many people sit in prison for extended periods without sentencing. In addition, the structure of sentencing, parole, rehabilitation, and reintegration remains under strain. The management of prisons is under fiscal and resources pressures. The historical design of the system, intended for control, makes change